So I'd like to start with the problem, which is that most websites and applications that launch today aren't accessible. Compared to when I started over 15 years ago as a usability consultant, in those days, it was really easy to find usability issues with pretty much any website you looked at. But that's come on a long way. UX has had such a sort of great influence. When I was looking around at places like websites that suck to try and find some bad examples, it's a lot harder these days. Pretty much anything featured on there has probably changed already. But that change hasn't really happened in accessibility. It's still very easy to go to almost any website at random and find accessibility issues in seconds. So we aren't managing to create inclusive websites and digital products. And I think one of the main reasons for that is leaving it too late in the process, leaving it as a sort of more technical issue towards the end of the process rather than tackling it as a design problem. So I'm not going to be sort of confrontational in this. I think there's sort of great scope for change, but it's a matter of where that change happens. So I tend to think about accessibility as almost like a subset of UX. So it's usability for particular people using particular technologies. In practice, it also very much helps to know about the access technologies that people can use, and also the web standards, or in fact, sort of digital platform standards like iOS. If you know about those, you know sort of who's responsible for what, and it can narrow the scope of your problem. And it's also worth saying that UX and accessibility really have to go hand in hand, because if something isn't usable, it's not going to be accessible for that population either. I guess one of the problems is that there are interfaces being created now where they are sort of created in the name of UX, but that can be fundamentally inaccessible, and they don't need to be. Just as a couple of examples, and I hope the videos work. Imagine you can't use a mouse, could be through Parkinson's or motor impairment or something along those lines. So your interaction with a website is essentially to tab through it. You might have various different inputs, but essentially it's like a keyboard pressing tab. And if I do that on this website, you'll see the blue sort of highlights move along. Now imagine you want to get to something on the right-hand side. So you keep going. It's a sort of very linear approach. And the problem is, if you look at the scroll bar, this is one of those websites with infinite scroll. So you never get there. Now, you can work around that, but it's a sort of a fundamental problem. And I found this when looking for sort of parallax type scrolling. I can imagine the conversation that happened. It's like, we do, we do flights. Let's do an interface where you fly. You go through the clouds and things appear at you. And I'm sure that was sort of almost done in the name of experience. But if you then imagine you don't see so well. So one of the ways that you would deal with that is to make things bigger. So one of the main ways of doing that is to use a magnifier. So if we magnify onto the screen, you're seeing a small area of the screen, and you use your mouse to go around it. So if we then scroll, you've got two types of scrolling going on. We've got our mouse moving things around, and we've got the actual scrolling of the page, which is causing all these things to appear randomly in two-dimensional space. I kind of gave up on this one because I eventually got to a page because it had that right-hand navigation, but then there didn't seem to be anything there. So I zoomed out. So one of the key questions, I mean, these are conceptually inaccessible, and it would be fairly obvious to an accessibility expert that's the case. But how do we spread that knowledge out? How do we get that earlier into the design process? So over the last couple of years, I've run workshops with lots of design teams, development teams, project managers, that sort of audience. And you might have a different process. And generally at the beginning of that, where people think accessibility fits is either in the sort of coding or the QA side. It might be fairly obvious it's too late, but what I did at the end of these workshops, so after an introduction, after we've been through the guidelines, I would ask them to say when they could first define or test each accessibility criteria. So, for example, you could check that the navigation is consistently placed pretty much from sketching. And that actually applies to a lot. Fairly consistently, at least 70% of the checks that you could do, they thought you could do before coding. So we are generally leaving things too late. And I think that actually is the sort of the main failure I'm talking about, is not considering it a design problem. So the impact is usually, well, it's either you launch with accessibility issues or you increase the development time when you find out about those issues too late. So how do we get that thinking into the design process? I mean, there's a few methods I've come across. I'm kind of going to knock them down, but a lot of people start with the guidelines. And don't get me wrong, the guidelines are very useful, kind of a Bible for me. But what I tend to find is if you use those, it sort of very much becomes a technical thing or a QA thing. I mean, how many people, show of hands, have actually read the guidelines? And keep your hand up if you feel like you understood them or in fact finished them. Okay, about a small proportion of the people who started reading them. And it kind of leads to bolt-on accessibility. It's things left to the last minute, and then you have to come up with some workaround that doesn't really fit the interface. It's very much a bolt-on. Another thing people try is, okay, let's add an accessibility persona. Okay, that's great. The problem is personas tend to work best if they're oriented around goals, tasks, motivations. And if you think of a sort of normal distribution of tasks, for anyone with an accessibility issue, they're likely to have the same tasks that somebody without one would have. So if we added personas for somebody with mobility impairment, you'd kind of have to do it for every persona. And the same for visual and auditory. You end up with a matrix of personas, which is not really their intended use. You could also invite in an expert, so maybe somebody who uses a screen reader, and I think that would be a useful experience for everyone involved. However, it suffers from the same problem of not really scaling very well. Oh, that wasn't the right button. Let's try that again. So what you could end up with, if you included screen reader users, magnifier users, somebody with mobility impairment, is almost like a focus group of experts. So that doesn't really scale. Another thing I've seen quite often is, we'll put it on the backlog. So there's this accessibility item, make accessible, and it tends to be almost like superglued in place. It doesn't tend to come off of that. And the other problem, similar to personas, is the scaling problem. Actually, accessibility should be a quality aspect of each of those features, not a separate thing in itself. So, last one. Quite often people will say, how do I design for somebody with a visual impairment? That's more complicated than it sounds. You get at least sort of two types of interaction going on. Somebody with a moderate visual impairment might use a screen magnifier, like we looked at in the example before, where you sort of zoom in, and it's a very mouse-orientated interaction. Or they might be completely blind and need a screen reader. That's a very keyboard-orientated interaction and pretty much no use of the mouse. So those are different things. And it gets more complicated. For example, somebody with a cognitive impairment might use a screen reader because it helps to have things read out, not necessarily what you would have expected. So what I've done over the years is boil it down, very much in my head, sort of simmered and reduced, down to 4 interaction styles that I pay attention to. And at every stage through the design, I think through how would somebody using this interaction style use whatever it is I'm making. So keyboard only, but can see the screen. Screen magnification, where you make things bigger. Screen reader is very much a sort of almost a unique interaction style. And then cognitive and deafness might look like an odd pairing. It's where there's no special technology involved, but there are probably language issues. So I'll go quickly through these. For keyboard only, many assistive technologies work as a keyboard, even if they don't look like a keyboard. All the operating systems have keyboard-like access built in. Stephen Hawking, probably the most famous Switch user that I could think of. He essentially has a computer that runs through all of the options, and he twitches a muscle in his cheek, which is detected by something in his glasses, and he selects it. This can be due to things like tremors, Parkinson's, arthritis. There's sort of many things that will cause people to use something like a keyboard. And it's becoming more mainstream. Anyone with an iOS device with, I think, iOS 7 or above, you can hook in a Bluetooth switch. And a little demo, it just goes through each item, and using the switch, you literally press a button, or blink in Stephen Hawking's case, and it selects it. And it quite often has context menus, and that's how you get around, and everything can work. And there's a really simple way of testing this for yourself. Anytime you go to a website, the tab key. Tab to go forwards, shift tab to go back, enter to follow links. It is the easiest thing that most people forget. If you want to find out, try this key. And I'll show a good example. I know it's an older version of the homepage, but it makes a better demo. The BBC, as we tab through, you can get skip links at the start. If you want to skip over the navigation, they appear when you're tabbing through. You can see where the focus point is. They haven't taken away the blue outline. Anything that is triggered on mouse over is also triggered by the keyboard as you go through. You won't notice, but it doesn't let you go through the background of the carousel, which a lot of carousels will allow you to do, so you can kind of get lost. Another thing that's useful to try is to press Command or Control F and type ahead to find a link and follow that link, which very much equates to voice input, so things like Dragon Naturally Speaking. So when we think about those interaction effects, it's very linear. You're going through link by link, and not the content, just the links. It ends up being an awful lot of key presses. So things like skip links can be very helpful. That pictured is a head wand. So you could make a joke about some websites being a pain in the neck. But it also means that visuals are important because you're looking at the screen as you're tabbing through, and things like skip links become really important. So that's keyboards. Screen magnification, or generally make stuff bigger. There's a couple of types depending on how things are set up. If you're using a browser, so we've got the default, if you press Command plus and it's a responsive website, it will zoom in, it will make all the pixels bigger effectively, and if you've got a responsive website or a responsive app, it will still fit to the width, and what you end up with is effectively the mobile display. If you don't have a responsive site, you sort of zoom in onto a small area of the screen. So just as a quick demo, this is the sort of non-responsive version. If we imagine we can't see too well, and then we magnify using the browser, you kind of lose the right-hand side of the page. So imagine trying to read a long article scrolling around line by line. Not great experience. So don't usually use Microsoft, but it makes a good demo. We do the same thing and then zoom in. Everything is contained within the width because it's a responsive website. In fact, you can push it even further, and you really get down to, essentially the mobile display. And that's responsive web design has been great for people who need to zoom, who need to make things bigger. But above about 200%, you don't just need web content and applications to be bigger, you need your whole system to be bigger. So that's where a full screen magnifier would come in. So here's an example from John Lewis. Imagine I want to buy this mouse, and they show sort of a good practice from a magnification point of view, where when I add something to the basket, you can tell immediately where you are, something has happened. I don't know how many e-commerce sites you've used, and the little basket on the top right sort of changes subtly, and you have to notice that. If you're sort of old school, locus of attention is a good one to look up. What can be problematic, though, is things like mega menus, because if you're scrolling your whole screen around, you literally have to push off the left side of the menu in order to find that left side. So if I'm trying to buy jeans, that's quite difficult. John Lewis is one of the better examples because it doesn't immediately disappear when you mouse out. It gives you a chance to bring the mouse back in. So as interaction effects go, for browser zoom, if it's non-responsive, you get a lot of horizontal scrolling. So responsive websites are definitely the way forward for that. It also means that if you are testing on mobile, you're already testing for zoom, so that box is ticked. Good contrast obviously helps, but also consider that if you're using a magnifier, it's very mouse-driven, so you use the keyboard as little as possible. And your field of attention is very small, so watch out for any time where things are happening in different areas of the screen. Screen readers, a very unique interaction. It's another linear one, but a little bit different from keyboard access. So this is a picture I took at a conference. There was a gentleman sitting next to me using Braille output, but it's sitting on top of a standard Windows laptop running probably Internet Explorer with JAWS, which you might associate with the sort of robotic speech output, but it also has Braille output. That's very useful for him in a conference situation because he could listen to the speaker and read on his fingers. Now, the thing about screen readers, and this is where I discover if we've got sound hooked up or not, maybe, is they read out all the content, but also the information around the content, the structure, the metadata. And we do have sound. So see how much isn't actually content, it's around the content.
2 items heading level 2, site menu. List 5 items. Link, home, link, about us, link, topic, 1. Landmarks 5 items, banner.
So hidden attributes in the page create this.
Table of contents with 3 items navigation. Link, heading level 1, example page.
Allows you to navigate around the page much more quickly than a keyboard user.
Heading level 2, an image. Heading level 1.
Keyboard commands to skip around headings.
Level 2, an image. The A3 branch covered in a clear layer of eyes. The effects of rain and winter. Heading level 2, lists. Heading level 2, tables. Where you need to know the heading in order to understand the cell. Table 3 columns, 3 rows. Copy. Column T. Column 3 of 3.
Column read out.
Alastair. Copy. 1.
Reads out the heading as you go through.
T. 0.
So all that's based on standard HTML, basically. Applications also tend to have similar structures. So essentially, when you're looking at a design, it's how do I convey that design in code? So the interaction effects with a screen reader, again, it's very linear. It's a line at a time, essentially in source code order, although that might change with future CSS. You can use heading, landmarks, and finding within the page, again, to skim through the page in the same way that you or I might visually skim through the page. You can use hidden support text. So if you've got a section of the page which has no, which is sort of defined by its design and the structure in the page, you can maybe hide in a heading or something to explain that. And it's worth remembering it depends on learned keyboard commands. If you have no sort of GUI, nothing reminding you what the options are, it very much depends on things you know already. So if you come up with some totally new interaction that uses different keyboard commands to what somebody is used to, they won't know about it. So the last group, a rather wide and vaguely defined group, but it's one I sort of use that isn't dependent on technology. So cognitive is everything from dyslexia through learning difficulties, being on the autistic spectrum. And I group deafness here because apart from the obvious, not being able to hear, you often get language issues. Because if you're born deaf, your first language is sign language. English is a second language. And especially I've found in usability testing with older participants, the education system wasn't that great going back 20, 30 years. So a lot of people really struggle with reading, and the effects I see in usability testing is like a sort of main menu where you don't understand any of the options. So it's one of the more difficult ones to deal with, and in general, a good UX process should help with this. But one thing you can take away from this, hopefully, is it's not just about code and text, it's about supporting people's understanding with icons and imagery. So a test I like to run is to translate an interface into something I don't understand. So Yahoo makes a good example because you can still tell where to check your email, maybe where the football scores are going to be. So it's very much a matter of actually using imagery and iconography. A site that takes it to, or at least used to take it to, the ultimate sort of nth degree was the Quality Care Commission, who used the sort of easy read concept, where everything on the page had an associated image. And from a sort of usability background, I thought that was going to be rubbish. It's really hard to convey information through pictures and iconography in that way. But when testing with people who had learning difficulties or even on the autistic spectrum, they focused more on the images. They got more out of them than I did. So the interaction effects, choosing links that might be right but not knowing. I've seen people get quite far through tasks just on cross-site convention. Things like, contact is usually the last link in the main navigation. I'd see people get stuck on literal interpretations. So if you talked about blue sky thinking, they'd start looking out the window. And looking for helpful alternatives like search. If you scan a navigation and you don't understand things in it, typing in a word you understand might get you to the page you need. So these are the 4 questions. Can you use it with a keyboard? Can you see it when zoomed? Does it provide appropriate information and metadata for screen readers? And is it easy to understand? So how early can we check these? Well, I tried to say earlier, it's pretty much from the beginning. Anytime you've got something to look at, you can check something. So, for example, if we take this very basic homepage, sketch of a homepage, and think about keyboard interaction, I could point out maybe how those drop-downs are going to work with the keyboard. I've seen many carousels where the little controls aren't even focusable with the keyboard, let alone usable. The same goes for videos and things. Quite often, you just tab through and tab straight past the video with no controls. And the lightbox aspect as well. If you are opening up essentially a modal dialogue, does it move the keyboard focus into that dialogue? If we think about screen magnifiers and you open up a light box, where does the box appear? How do you know it's appeared if you can't see the top of the screen? If you think about screen reader users and you've got an auto-playing carousel, how's that going to affect somebody who's moving through the content of the page? What I quite often see, a carousel moves automatically, it kicks the screen reader user back up to the top of the page. It's like playing Frogger. And for the video, if it's a talking head CEO, you probably don't need to worry about audio description, but if it's a cookery program or something, then you may very well need an audio description for that video. Looking at it from a cognitive point of view, auto-playing carousels can stop somebody from reading a page. Any sort of movement on the screen will stop somebody from using it, so we'd always recommend a pause button. And from a deafness point of view, have you thought about adding captions? So another thing we'd recommend is, at the earliest possible stage, mark up your sketches. So you've got some kind of representation, whether it's a sketch or wireframe or whatever, mark them up with the elements. I can tweet out some links later about sort of a quick cheat sheet of HTML and ARIA structures. But essentially, what is the banner? What's the navigation? What's the heading structure? Even if you're not a developer and you don't necessarily know exactly how it's going to be implemented, it should start a conversation with the developers. So they might point out straight away, you've forgotten your heading 1 on this page. Another thing you can do is to just mark what you think the keyboard focus order is going to be. So in this case, it's sort of fairly straightforward. But that, again, could start a conversation with a developer to say, actually, it's not going to work like that. And either you come to an alternate solution, or they maybe put in a workaround. When it comes to the visual design, hopefully you've solved a lot of the problems already. But if you're in a situation where you have to sort of deliver comps that get signed off, it's a really good idea to make sure the contrast works before you get to that sign-off stage. So I like the color contrast analyzer, a little bit old school, but it works on anything you can show on screen. So you do the foreground, background, and you're looking for a green tick at the AA level. Another aspect is documentation. If you document things like mouse over links and that sort of stuff, make sure you include the focus links as well. So anything that has a sort of mouse-orientated interaction, have you thought about the keyboard one as well? When it comes to implementation, this is very much where the sort of rubber hits the road. So it's a point where you really can test, does the tab work, what happens when you zoom in, all of those aspects. So, and it kind of does need to be everyone's responsibility. Don't shunt it through to QA for them to check that stuff when you haven't even pressed the tab key yet. Automated testing can be useful for catching some issues, big caveat. So if you want to use something like Wave or Tenon that has an API, you can maybe hook that into any sort of build process that you've got, and if it fails, if it brings up issues, your build fails, you go in and fix them. That's great. But it's only a small subset of issues, and it can only test for failure. It can't test for success. So just taking a really simple example, if you've got alt text, it can tell you if it's missing. It can't tell you if it's good. Really easy to prove. I would also recommend, especially if you're using a content management system, setting up the interface for accessibility. So maybe take away all the sort of dodgy WYSIWYG features for fonts and that sort of stuff. Make things like alternative text mandatory in the interface. And that's really going to help prevent a whole host of problems going straight into the live site. And lastly, training. I mean, this has been a whirlwind tour. I've covered a lot of things very quickly. So there's training both in terms of understanding accessibility, but also for content management system users, incorporate that accessibility into their CMS training rather than having a separate thing. So what I'm trying to aim for is kind of elegant accessibilities, things that are built in. So, you might not notice that there's a wheelchair access built into this set of stairs. So apparently this does actually have its own health and safety issues, but it makes for a good metaphor. And I was looking around for a digital sort of equivalent and just thinking that it's really hard to find those because if it's done well, you don't notice. But I did think of one example, the humble skip link. So what tends to happen when things are left too late is you find a skip link and you tab through the page and you get this little blue link just hidden underneath the logo, which when you think about who's using it, people who need to see the screen, their switch may be going through quite quickly, you miss it really easily. So just in comparison, on a Nomensa website, bang, straight at the top, it's almost the first thing you get. So if I go back to that, and it's done in the design of the website. So this was done by a designer, whereas the previous example was done by a developer, and I'm not criticizing them, but they had to stick it in at the last minute. So whenever you get to an interface, think of those 4 questions, and hopefully that will solve a lot more problems a lot earlier in the process. Any questions?
Thank you.
Do you have any advice to help people to download the PDF? I mean, the PDF are accessible or?
PDFs can be accessible. In about 2005, Adobe basically added an accessibility layer into the PDF standard. However, people have historically had bad experiences, and it's a lot harder to sort of manage the process of creating accessible PDFs because it needs to come from the source. So in the same way that you have structure in HTML for headings and things, you get that in applications like Word. So if the PDF comes out of Word and the person has used headings, not just font sizing, then you can get an accessible PDF if you don't use the print mechanism, only if you use the built-in Adobe sort of plug-in mechanism. So the number of PDFs that are accessible is very small, relatively. Yeah, you either have to manage the process of creating accessible PDFs or providing alternative versions. Yes. Hello.
I often come across the argument that intranets don't need to be accessible because reputationally, well, the risk is not that great. What do you say to that?
Legally, the risk is very similar, and the only case I'm aware of in the UK that actually went to court was based on an employee suing their employer about training material that wasn't accessible. I think they said, well, I think every case has pretty much settled out of court so far. It was P&G. Anyone else?
Yeah, so down here, front.
Sorry.
So I do some work for an organization called Associated Services for the Blind, and one of the things we worry about all the time is that people who are blind are really disconnected from a lot of the web. And it strikes me that you talked about visual impairment, but not about blindness. And one question I have is whether you or other people are rethinking the interaction in a way that leads with the modality that blind people have, which is an auditory source of information. So rather than taking what is essentially a visual interface and making that visual interface accessible to start even before that, which is do away with the visual interface. And how does one then design for a blind population an experience of interacting with the web in which there's no visual platform to start with?
First question that pops to my mind is who would pay for that platform?
Well.
I mean, historically, the most successful sort of websites, including for the blind, and one of the modalities was screen reader. That's what that one is for. Are one interface for all, because otherwise, if you're creating separate interfaces for people, we used to have text-only sites. The BBC had a program that spat out a text-only version of their website. That doesn't necessarily actually help anyone. Another example, Tesco used to have a sort of separate accessibility site. They got rid of that because apart from ghettoizing a population, it meant that you had another interface to think about. So and this is where responsive web design has also helped, because that whole sort of mobile-first, content-first, make a linear interface has helped with screen reader users. So I would always go for sort of one interface for all, but checking those interaction styles. Does that answer your question?
It does, but it sounds to me as though that's a philosophical stance, right?
It's a very practical one.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a practical one, but I assume we're here to think beyond practicalities, right? And so an extreme sort of logical, if you take the argument to its logical extreme of a user experience, users are different, and that one might try to design the experience that's optimized for each kind of user. And so that's essentially the question.
You can, if you've got the resources to do that, go for it. So there's a lady up here whose hand keeps going up.
I really don't want a microphone. We've heard this morning about how sometimes value for the user and business values don't correlate necessarily, and we've run tests where I work where there's a conversion uplift on things that would be seen as inaccessible, so having a mega menu or having infinite scroll. And so my business would deem that better because it's making them money. Unfortunately, that's how they see things being better. How would you suggest people like me put significant pressure on the companies they work for to make their websites accessible?
taking infinite scroll as one of those examples, there are quite easy workarounds. You know, so for example, a skip link near the top of the page would get around that entirely, and that would then wouldn't be a problem. So I wouldn't, in practice, try and argue against something that's going to cause a conversion uplift. I would try and cause more of a conversion uplift by also making it accessible. I hope so. And is that it?
Round of applause for Alastair, please.
Cool.